describes his memory image of Peel Castle. I was thy neighbour once, thou rugged pile. 4 summer weeks I dwelt in sight of thee. I saw thee every day, and all the while thy form was sleeping on a glassy sea. The speaker then goes on to claim that where'er I looked, thy image still was there. It trembled, but it never passed away. Image here refers not just to the mirror image of Peel Castle in the water, but to the poet's internalizing of the sight into an image reproducible in poetry, as Michael O'Neill has it. A poetic power the speaker acknowledges he has lost, and which becomes a mere fond delusion of my heart. Still functions as both adverb and adjective in the text, evoking both the sense of the image the speaker creates, remaining in place and in time, of never passing away or dying, and a sense of stillness or calm. But of course, the image does pass away for the speaker, becoming a mere memory image, subsequently disturbing his sense of calm. Elegiac Stanzas goes on to explore how the poet would have painted the castle if his was still the painter's hand, and he's still in this state of fond delusion, able to, and I could add the gleam, the light that never was on sea or land. Interestingly, Wordsworth's verbal painting, as it were, foregrounds the discontinuity between his imagined painting of a beautiful or picturesque landscape and Beaumont's image of the sublime. And rather than simply mediating the language of visual impression and sensation here then, the text, I would suggest, also mediates Wordsworth's reflective, thoughtful language and its engagement with questions surrounding the reproducible image. The absorption of Wordsworth's language in the poem and its own concern with the mediation of reproducible images in art and poetry echoes the Lady of Shalot's own concern with the mediation of the visual image as the lady weaves representations of the world that she sees in her mirror, and moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear, etc. Wordsworth's acknowledgement in the elegiac stanzas of the disjunction between both poetic and visual art and their power to mediate the visual image and to convey truth and immutability echoes in the disjunction the Lady of Shalott itself acknowledges in the mirror that cracks, the web that floats wide, and the lady's own floating death. But Wordsworth does not conclude that mediation is impossible. The poet is still able to inhabit a conditional, illusory state in elegiac stanzas. In mediating Wordsworth's glassy image, then, Tennyson is therefore performing a retrospective act, echoing a Wordsworthian image that is successfully mediated. But Tennyson is drawing on the main topic of descriptive lyric, the mediation of the image, yet will nonetheless go on to conclude, through the lady's silent death, that mediation is nevertheless impossible. The poem ends by paying homage to Wordsworth through Lancelot's comment on the lady's lovely face. In describing the lady's face as lovely, the poem returns once more to Wordsworth's An Evening Walk. Here, in a section of the poem where the imagination begins its recovery after its descent into darkness, the moon in Wordsworth's poem is described as having a lovely face. See o'er the eastern hill where darkness broods, o'er all its vanished dells and lawns and woods, where but a mass of shade the sight can trace, she lifts in silence up her lovely face, etc. The moon's sense of actively flinging light suggests the rebuilding of the imagination after its decline into brooding darkness in the poem, and by association, the resurgence of Wordsworth's epistemology in Tennyson's poem. The play of light and shade here complements the play of light and shade in Tennyson's poem, in the mirror and the flash of Lancelot, for instance, combined with the shadows the lady self-creates. The Wordsworth imaginative process contains darkness as well as light, as Keats well observed. The lady has created her own shadows of sensation as well as being submissively in receipt of them. Autumn also echoes the move that has already taken place from summer to autumn in the poem, and therefore the blurring of the real and aesthetic worlds. Lancelot's somewhat pathetic, trivial summary of the Lady of Shalott, she has a lovely face, has been met with criticism and even incredulity, as Robert Douglas Fairhurst has pointed out. But the summary's provenance, that phrase, she has a lovely face, in Wordsworth goes some way to explaining Tennyson's unpoetic phrasing here. In sharing the words Wordsworth's moon's lovely face, the lady gains in visionary power and influence and is imbued with transcendental significance. The 1832 version of the text omits to position Lancelot among the onlookers at the end of the poem, closing with the words of the Lady of Shalott herself. The web was woven curiously, the charm is broken utterly, draw near and fear not, this is I, the Lady of Shalott. In including Lancelot's comment on the lady's lovely face, the 1842 text therefore affords Wordsworth a priority that the earlier version of the poem does not support, allowing Tennyson, as it were, to give a face to the Lady of Shalott. The English or domestic idylls, to which I've already referred, draw overtly on Wordsworth's unpoetical language and unpoetical universe. Returning thematically and linguistically to Wordsworth, they borrow Wordsworth's ordinary language and ordinary themes and ordinary people too, making explicit the pattern at work in the Lady of Shalott. Nostalgia for a pastoral way of life in The Gardener's Daughter, for instance, reveals Tennyson as not only indebted to Theocritus, especially the seventh idyll, as Rix reminds us, but also to the pastor's domestic vignette from Book 6 of Wordsworth's The Excursion from 1814. Rose, the gardener's daughter, her name itself a reminder of the cultured Rose of Book 6 of Wordsworth's poem, occupies a private garden, and I quote, not wholly in the busy world, nor quite beyond it. Verbal echoes in Tennyson's poem emphasize the garden's connections with that of its predecessor in The Excursion. The speaker of Book 6 describes the garden as this trim place. In The Gardener's Daughter, the deictic this turns to that, as the speaker describes how the gardener's daughter, in that still place, hoarded in herself, grew seldom seen. Each of the gardens is a private space, removed from public view, much like the daughters in the poems. And yet in both poems, this private space is disturbed by a male impostor or onlooker. In Book 6 of The Excursion, the pastor freely partakes of whatever the garden bears, whether fruit or flower, whilst in Tennyson's poem, the speaker looked upon or beheld the gardener's daughter in his sequestered place, freely partaking of her image, just as the pastor partakes of the garden's offerings. Tennyson's poem concludes with the gardener's daughter offering to the speaker the greatest gift, a woman's heart, although Tennyson does not confirm that the marriage has taken place, only that Rose has become the most blessed memory of mine age. Wordsworth's pastor observes in the daughter spinning at her wheel the survival on earth. In potentially becoming, Rose becomes an extension of the spirit of domestic bliss, fulfilling the destiny of Wordsworth's hardy girl. So, Tennyson, according to Armstrong, suffers a loss of nerve in the 1840s. The English idylls retreat from the poetry of sensation and the daring experimentalism of the Lady of Shalott into, she says, a domesticated and conventional Wordsworthianism. Yet the Lady of Shalott and the Gardener's Daughter form part of a whole, I would suggest, both drawing from and reworking Wordsworth's pastoral vignette from The Excursion. The movement back to Wordsworth here is therefore less of a retreat or a failure of nerve than a facilitation, allowing Tennyson once again to question the poetry's sensation and his own role within it, as well as allowing an exploration of the theme of gendered space. As in The Lady of Shalott, Tennyson's Ulysses liberally absorbs Wordsworth's language, but there are different effects and different consequences. Wordsworth's Intimations Ode, which I'll refer to as Ode hereafter, resonates throughout Ulysses, bringing with it its account of imaginative loss and recovery, made evident through the echoes and borrowings that make up the poem's principal moment of imaginative transcendence, namely Ulysses' claim that all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untravelled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. But there's also an allusion to arch here, which is evocative of the ode and other related Wordsworthian poems. Rather than an architectural metaphor, Richard Cronin reveals how Edward Lear reincarnates Tennyson's metaphor in solid Roman brick, for instance, in his watercolour The Campagna as seen through an arch on the Appian Way. Here the arch, I would say, corresponds to Wordsworth's use of the rainbow as a romantic trope for the imagination. In the ode, the rainbow is an object in nature which stimulates imaginative awareness in the speaker. It's also a reminder of the fragility of the creative imaginative act, which, like the rainbow itself, comes and goes. The deadbeat, perfunctory rhythm of the opening lines here, the rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose, and moon doth with delight to look round her when the heavens are bare, reflects the speaker's acknowledgement that the imaginative glory is for the moment spent. In My Heart Leaps Up from 1807, Wordsworth writes of how my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old or let me die. The rainbow becomes a trope for the speaker's imaginative power, a power with which the speaker was invested as a child and with which he hopes he will be continued to be invested as an old man. Imaginative power is linked too to a heart that can leap with a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. The last two lines of My Heart Leaps Up form an epigraph to the ode, emphasizing the linkage between the two texts. But the arch of the rainbow is a somewhat submerged presence in both the ode and My Heart Leaps Up nonetheless. Wordsworth writes of the rainbow in his own text, but not their arch. Tennyson writes of the arch in Ulysses, but not its bow. Wordsworth and Tennyson's poems thus become two halves of a whole, with the rainbow arch an emblematic trope transmitted between them. Arch and its submerged rainbow both permeate Ulysses, signifying the fragility of the transcendental imagination and qualifying Ulysses' search for imaginative immortality through the arch of experience, which results from the intertextual arch of influence created between the two poems. Other allusions to the ode also resonate through Ulysses, moving centrifugally around the sense of imaginative loss that's been introduced into the text through the allusion to the rainbow arch. Forever and the setting sun, for instance, from lines 176 and 196, find their way into the poem, sitting alongside the eternal silence of line 27, a recognized allusion to the ode. The borrowing of forever, where in the ode the speaker states, what though the radiance is which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight, colours Ulysses' imaginative projection through the arch of experience, with the loss to which the imagination can be subject. The margin of the untravelled world fades forever and forever. Whereas the speaker accepts that the radiance that was once so bright has been lost, but settles for a compensatory strength in what remains behind. In Ulysses, the powerful finality of Wordsworth's forever is given added urgency by the twin presence of another iambic forever, which together enact what Peter MacDonald calls a falling and rising cadence, signalling how Ulysses' untravelled imaginative world is visible yet out of reach. His desire to sail beyond the sunset in search of imaginative mortality is thwarted by the echo of the oath's setting sun that takes a sober colouring from an eye that has kept watch over man's mortality. By default, immortality echoes mortality, but without the mediation of the oath's replacement for imaginative loss to accompany it, the faith that looks through death and the human heart by which we live. Ulysses expresses a wish to move beyond the Wordsworthian setting sun, to move beyond the sunset. Yet the Wordsworthian echoes in the poem, pulling back to the losses the Wordsworthian imagination contains, but significantly without a means by which to navigate them. And it's only on the self that Ulysses can rely. Wordsworth's texts, the Ode included, are based on an extreme individualism, which is the self that creates transcendence and the self by association that recovers from transcendental loss. In Ulysses, the reliance on the priority of the self is seen to fail, and when the self fails, all fails. Through Ulysses' fractured epiphany, then, Tennyson exposes the over-reliance on the self on which Wordsworthian visionary transcendence is premised. There can be no imaginative recompense in nature, in the equivalent meanest flower that blows, for instance, as the self in Ulysses is incapable of assuaging its loss, as mind and heart fail to coalesce. As a result of the Wordsworthian borrowings in the text, then, Ulysses' journey is not one of personal growth through loss, as it is in Wordsworth, but one inhibited by the self and essentially over before it has begun. Ulysses' journey in pursuit of a Wordsworthian imagination that the poem has itself defined as lost reveals a deep-seated desire, nevertheless, to cleave to Wordsworth's imaginative processes in the poem rather than to supplant them. Tennyson has not so much a need for going forward in the poem, I would suggest, as a need for going back. But in questioning the priority of the self, Tennyson nevertheless strengthens the form of the monologue, which is predicated on the distancing of the subjectivity of the romantic lyrical speaker. Yet the linkage to Wordsworth implicitly acknowledges the necessity of Wordsworth's imaginative process and of Wordsworth's language. It is these which form the frame on which the poem hangs. In Memoriam, I argue, Tennyson borrows Wordsworth's words and phrases as an aid to writing of the poem. Tennyson's borrowings from Wordsworth help the later poet to work towards finding his own form of consolation, however tenuous this consolation subsequently proves to be, and therefore to make his accommodations with his faith and with the claims of 19th century science and religion, and thus with the loss of Hallam himself. Tennyson borrows the gifts that Wordsworth's language have to offer, and in drawing on Wordsworth in this way, Tennyson is drawing on a poet who is able to articulate his grief and is able to move towards finding a form of consolation. Many of the Wordsworthian poems from which Tennyson borrows are themselves elegies. Tennyson returns to a site of loss, the elegy itself, and gains strength from it, turning Wordsworth's losses into a gain, or at least a difference. In Memoriam famously totters unsteadily towards consolation, faltering where it should firmly tread. But Tennyson borrows from Wordsworth's elegies as poetic models, as poems that do articulate grief and do work toward consolation, even if this consolation is elided, as in elegiac stanzas. Tennyson acknowledges the disjunction between mind and nature that occurs in elegiac stanzas, but draws on the resources of the poem to work towards his own form of consolation. Douglas Fairhurst notes how, and I quote, so many of In Memoriam's literary echoes emerge from contexts of loss, the splintered remains of earlier elegies that rise unpredictably to the surface of Tennyson's verse, like the debris of shipwrecks. I suggest, however, that Wordsworth's elegies do not randomly rise to the surface of In Memoriam, and nor do they lie inert like the debris of abandoned shipwrecks. Rather, Tennyson borrows from Wordsworth's elegies to help him conceive and write the poem, weaving their language and phrasing into new configurations and connections, the poem's trajectory toward the one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves in the epilogue is facilitated by Wordsworth's language in this sense. So how might this actually work in the poem? Wordsworth's classical influence is clearly evident in section 95 of In Memoriam. Duncan Wu writes convincingly of how the thrice-waved hand in Wordsworth's The Vale of Esthwaite. Now as we wandered through the gloom in Black Hill Vallin's inmost womb, the spectre made a solemn stand, slow round my head thrice waved his hand, etc. Suggesting that this carries the same inscrutable logic as Aeneas's 3 attempts to embrace his dead father when he descends into the underworld in the Aeneid, Book 6. Similar classical connections are to be found in the draft passage of the Solitary's apostrophe to his dead daughter, the tuft of primroses in Wordsworth's Excursion. Wordsworth writes of the departing child that never shall be displaced by the returning substance, seen or touched, seen by my eyes or clasped in my embrace. As Wu makes clear in his comments on the poem, it can be no accident that clasping in his arms is precisely what Orpheus had wanted to do with Eurydice, a desire painfully faithful to bereavement, as it oscillates between incredulity at loss and the vain hope that the dead are not gone forever. In section 95 of In Memoriam, the term touch carries, amongst its other meanings, a sense of touch in a tactile sense. Feature frequently in the poem as critics did. However, the stress of the iambic tetrameter in line 34 of section 95, where the dead man touched me from the past, underlines the act of touching the dead touching the dead through time that's taking place, dead touched from past. The speaker and the dead Hallam in section 95 therefore touch in the underworld, achieving the contact Aeneas can attempt only in his triple wave of the hand. But Wordsworth's classical models remain tragic, as the dead may be revisited but not necessarily reclaimed. For example, Aeneas and Orpheus descend into the underworld as to re-experience loss. Significantly, in the Tuft of Primroses, restoration of the dead is impossible, and the consolation of an afterlife denied. All we have, in fact, is the finality of death. In Memoriam too, the dead man touched the speaker from the past, linking hands through time, but he can remain only lost, revisited but not reclaimed, caught in a continuous process of revisiting a loss or absence, in an act that mirrors the cyclical return of the in memoriam stanza form itself. If Wordsworth facilitates Tennyson's tentative moment of communion, then he also denies the later poet, the full spiritual or physical unity he seeks. The effect here is of the myth of Echo herself, or more accurately, Orpheus. Tennyson, like Orpheus, is perpetually confined to nothing but a backward glance. Tennyson moves, I would suggest, from borrowing Wordsworth in section 95 to achieve the moment of tenuous communion, to drawing on Wordsworth to give a sense of how grief can nevertheless be healed or at least managed. Lines 15 and 16 and 51 and 52 of section 95 are repetitions of each other and confirm this sense of return and reclamation, or at least suggest its possibility. The white kine glimmered and the trees laid their dark arms about the field. Echoes to Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard sound through these lines. But the lines also echo another Wordsworthian poem written in very early youth, a poem concerned with the imagination and its capacity in its relationship with nature to alleviate loss. On the village, silence sets her seal, and in the glimmering vale the last lights die. The kine obscurely seen before me lie, round the dim horse that crops his later meal scarce heard. Grief is healed here through the imagination, through that strange harmony where the speaker is temporarily at peace, implicitly restoring what has been lost. The kine are obscurely seen in Wordsworth's poem. Tennyson's, by contrast, glimmer in and out of view. The eye from Wordsworth's glimmering, light die and lie are transcribed into the white kine glimmered in Tennyson's poem, encapsulating a sense of trembling possibility. The repetition of I also produces a slowing effect, replicating the sense of silence and stasis in Wordsworth's poem. These effects occur in the lines that act as a frame to the moment of communion in section 95 itself, suggesting that nature holds the key to the restoration of the dead. As in Wordsworth's Nutting, there is a suggestion that there's a spirit or shade in the woods, this time glimmering amongst the white kine, quietly hinting at the return of the dead. The spirit is sacred, but is also the spirit that is Hallam, silently awaiting his return. Tennyson echoes Wordsworth's nature in an attempt to restore what is lost. His grief can possibly be healed, and Hallam restored, albeit tentatively. The play of light and dark in the luminously glimmering kine and the dark arms about the field unsettle this idea, however, as the dark arms contain echoes of the hands that reach through time, placing the text back in the position of revisiting a loss. So Tennyson, I would say, is both nourished by Wordsworth here and constrained by him. The momentary communion Tennyson describes is fed by Wordsworth's language, but can end only in quivering, faltering uncertainty. I want to move on now to look at Tennyson's Maud, which I suggest also contains an echo chamber of voices. Most famously, of course, Shakespeare's Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. But I contend that Wordsworth, as with the other poems I've been looking at this evening, has a far bigger part to play in the poem than previously recognised, traceable through the borrowings and echoings of words and phrases. The presence of this borrowed language creates a multiplicity of effects. Some borrowings allow Tennyson to remodulate Wordsworth, allowing him to define himself in relation to his predecessor. Others define him in turn, controlling the trajectory of the poem and questioning its narrative form. Others allow Tennyson to address issues which the poem ostensibly avoids. Yet others allow Tennyson to question his role as public poet and as poet of sensation again. The poem is thus challenged, deflected, supported, sustained, and questioned by the Wordsworthian language it contains. Wordsworth's echoing presence is clearly heard in the Maud who appears in the slumber-breaking vision in part 1 of Tennyson's poem. Clear and cold-cut face, why come you so cruelly meek, breaking a slumber in which all spleenful folly was drowned, etc. The description of Maud here recalls the early poems on Rosa Bering, which Tennyson composed in 1835-6, such as I lingered yet a while to bend my way. The Shining Daffodil owes a debt to Wordsworth, which Tennyson openly acknowledges to his friend James Henry Mangles. But there are other subtle Wordsworthian echoes in this passage too, as Tennyson returns to Wordsworth's Lucy poems, such as A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal from 1800 and She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, also from 1800. In the second of the Lucy ballads, She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, Wordsworth describes the isolated maid whom there were none to praise, it seems, except the poem's speaker. She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the springs of Dove, a maid whom there were none to praise and very few to love, etc. So Tennyson, I would suggest, borrows from Wordsworth's description of Lucy in his account of Maud, a star sweet on a gloom profound. But where Lucy is fair as a star when only one is shining in the sky, the vision of Maud forces the speaker into his garden ground, where he finds the shining daffodil dead. W.E. Backler notes that the myth of Echo and Narcissus, with variations, forms a subtext in Maud, remarking how sweet Narcissus changes in the published edition of the poem to shining daffodil dead. Tennyson may have made the switch, Backler suggests, to keep his subtext from surfacing too obviously. This is according to Ricks. In keeping with one subtext at bay, however, Tennyson allows another, Wordsworth, to surface. And as well as drawing from She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways to furnish his description of Maud, Tennyson also borrows from Wordsworth's A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal to render the speaker's feeling. Like She Dwelt Among the Untrodden Ways, A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal pivots on the speaker's feeling or passion for Lucy as he confronts the reality of her loss. But there are differences. Most obviously, Tennyson breaks a slumber, whereas in Wordsworth, a slumber is the speaker's spirit, preventing him from forming an imaginative connection with Lucy. The speaker of Wordsworth's poem is denied a vision of Lucy through his slumber, in fact, with the implicit criticism that this occasions. Equally, the occasion for imaginative connection is lost in the hiatus between the two stanzas of Wordsworth's poem, as Hartman has pointed out several years ago. But unlike Wordsworth's speaker, Tennyson's speaker's slumber is broken, allowing him to achieve a vision of Maud. But the vision that comes on him is a nightmarish one of a cold, clear-cut face, coolly meek, breaking a slumber during which all spleenful folly had previously been drowned. The vision is born in memory, with the speaker recalling Maud's provocative ride past the speaker in her carriage with her cold, clear-cut face. Maud, in a sense, I would suggest, fulfills the thwarted expectation of Wordsworth's poem, providing the vision of Lucy denied to the speaker through his mistimed slumber, appearing ghost-like and death-like, but nevertheless clear-cut. If the Lucy of A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal is rolled round with rocks and stones and trees, rocks and stones, here those rocks and stones are transfigured into gem-like luminosity, and in Tennyson. And yet Maud replicates Lucy's inability to hear or see, growing and fading without a sound upon the speaker. The phrase too deep alludes directly to the ode. In the ode, the speaker describes thoughts that are too deep for tears, yet finds recompense for his early visionary losses in the human heart by which we live and the philosophic mind. Tennyson's speaker could bear the vision that grows and fades upon him no more, a phrase that resonates through in memoriam, as we've already seen. The phrase echoes in Tennyson's speaker's memory as he remembers the dead perfection no more of Maud as she passes in her carriage. Maud is charged by the speaker with taking revenge too deep for a slight innocently done in thought to her beauty. The nightmarish vision of Maud is womanlike, taking revenge much too deep for a transient wrong. So Wordsworth's commitment to the human heart in the ode is here twisted into a female heart intent on revenge, seemingly uninflected by philosophic thought. Tennyson's borrowings from Wordsworth, I would suggest, enable Maud's speaker's distorted solipsism. The fact that Maud is luminous emphasizes the visionary heritage of his nightmarish vision. The delicate balance of feeling and memory in Wordsworth's A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal is exaggerated into madness and hallucination, distortion and blame in Maud, with Tennyson both drawing from his source and hyperbolizing it. O'Neill notices how Wordsworth's mad mothers, such as Martha in The Thorn, informed Tennyson's Mariana, sitting alone in her dreamy house and wishing she were dead. But here the Lucy poems form a prototype for Maud and the speaker's descent into madness, as Tennyson takes Wordsworth's expressions of passion to extremes. A slumber did my spirit seal suggests that the route to imaginative connection has been lost or ignored, blocking union with the lost Lucy herself. Maud is an extenuation, or perhaps more accurately, a completion of a slumber did my spirit seal in this sense. Tennyson's speaker becomes a version of Wordsworth's speaker, offered the vision that Wordsworth was denied, or that was forfeited when his slumber was sealed, or at least a vision as imagined by Tennyson, his own version of Wordsworth. Tennyson is in a sense reinventing the Lucy poems, and to some extent Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, and mooring the poem from Wordsworth's affiliation of passion with morality, sympathy and emotion recollected in tranquility. In lines 252 to 67 in part 1 of Maud, the speaker gives an account of his condition of alienation, living alone in an empty house, where half hid in the gleaming wood, etc. The passage is famous for its resemblance to Mariana, like the Lady of Shalott, one of Tennyson's early poems of sensation, in which the speaker is trapped within her own subjectivity and to some extent her language. But Wordsworth's language here also forms a presence, allowing Tennyson to ponder his role as poet. In reaching out to Wordsworth's language of reflection, Tennyson is able to question his designation as a poet of sensation again, but also his ability to invent and sustain new poetic forms that, like the phases of passion that constitute Maud. The speaker's dancing leaves, for instance, dance to the sound and rhythm of Wordsworth's The Green Linnet, where the dazzling bird is so like the dancing leaves, who induces unbounded joy in the speaker observing him. Tennyson, by contrast, makes his dancing leaves shiver, converting Wordsworthian joy into obsessive foreboding. The joy of imaginative connection is displaced by the despair of imaginative disconnection. In borrowing from Wordsworth's The Green Linnet, Tennyson aligns the text with a lyric in which the song or flight of the bird becomes an emblem of the poet's own voice, of his vocation, in the original sense of a calling or a summons as a poet. The speaker's dancing leaves thus become a metonym for Tennyson's analysis of his own calling or summons as a poet, including whether he can function as a dramatic artist without Wordsworth. The monodrama of Maud is never very far from Wordsworth, and the borrowings from the early poems serve to underline this fact. Wordsworth's The Thorn, for instance, a poem that forms a prototype for the madness of Mariana's speaker, as I've already mentioned, can also be read as an exploration of the erotic subconscious of its speaker, paving the way for Tennyson's exploration of the erotic unconscious of the speaker in Maud. The borrowings from Wordsworth, therefore, crystallize the way in which Tennyson weaves a dramatic situation around a very few beautiful lyrics, as T.S. Eliot has it. But more than this, they reveal the extent to which Tennyson relies on Wordsworth, both to shape and structure the poem, but also play into his compositional anxieties around the writing of the poem itself. Wordsworth has a decisive presence in Tithonus, the last of the major poems I'm going to be looking at this evening, most famously in the opening line of the 1860 version of the poem, which is borrowed from the Simple and Past section of the Prelude, published in 1845. The Tintern Abbey or lines written above Tinternabie has strong thematic links in the poem too. Tithonus, according to Seamus Perry, works a remarkable variation on the theme of recurrence in Tinternabie, with Tithonus always the same, yet dreadfully mutable, continually reminded of his changefulness by the goddess of the dawn's own returning on his silver wheels. I suggest, however, that Tithonus does more than simply provide a remarkable variation on Tinternabie's trope of recurrence, however, revising the connection between memory and nature underpinning Wordsworth's narrative of returning. Richard Cronin reveals how Tennyson did not find an easy connection between nature and the moral life. Even as an undergraduate, Tennyson was convinced that the existence of an intelligible first cause could not be deducible from the phenomena of the universe. Tennyson, in a way Wordsworth is not, is attuned to the scientific view that the world is subject to physical laws which are assumed to be independent of human psychology. Using Wordsworth's psychologized relation to Tithonus, then, Tennyson can thus seemingly release himself from an anachronistic Wordsworthian narrative that's in the process of being superseded by the findings of 19th century science. So how might this work in the poem itself? Tithonus, I suggest, works its poetic magic under Tinternabie's quiet sky, in that quiet limit of the world where spaces are ever silent. In Wordsworth's poem, the speaker is nourished by nature under this quiet sky with its green earth and its waters rolling from their mountain springs. Nature provides a way for the speaker to see into the life of things, to gain a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whatever that something is. Nature's beauteous forms and the memory of those forms, when the picture of the mind revives again and evoke that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and weary weight of all this intelligible world is lightened. This process is in turn a product of eye and ear, but both what they half create and what they perceive. A random process, although the gleams of transcendence are always in danger of being half extinguished. Dorothy, the speaker's auditrix, becomes the person to whom the experiences of the eye and ear are entrusted, the guardian of those memories that have the capacity to sustain the self. The speaker hopes to read his former pleasures in the shooting lights of her wild eyes. In Tithonus, Tennyson's borrowings and echoes of the earlier poem assign a similar role to Aurora, in that she is the speaker's auditrix, but also nature, though not simply in the sense of pathetic fallacy. Verbal echoes between Tithonus and Tinternabie underline the connections between both Aurora and nature, and Aurora and Dorothy in the latter's capacity as nature. Aurora's beauty is emphasized in Tithonus, evoked through the beauteous of forms of nature carried over from Tinternabie. The speaker confirms that she ever thus grows beautiful. Her beauty will be renewed morn by morn. Likewise, nature can impress with her silence. In Tinternabie, Aurora lives in a realm of beautiful silence. Moreover, nature and the language of the sense anchor the speaker's purest thoughts in Tinternabie, and Tennyson's Aurora is described as having pure brows and shoulders, pure, immersing herself in the language and epistemology of the earlier poem. It is from these pure brows and pure shoulders that the old mysterious glimmer of imaginative transcendence steals for Tithonus, deepening the sense of Aurora as Wordsworth's nature in the poem. Tennyson's allusions to Tinternabie also feed into Aurora's eroticism in Tithonus. Although this is an eroticism streaked with the artificial, a disingenuousness suppressed or denied in Wordsworth's poem itself. If Dorothy is wild nature, then she is nature with its social inscription denied. Wordsworth is often criticized for greening nature, for portraying her as a purely benign force, and for failing to acknowledge that she is a construct as much as she is an expression of natural forces. Aurora's erotic seduction of Tithonus makes Wordsworth's artifice manipulation of the natural world unambiguous, as Tennyson's borrowings allow her to become a fully sexualized and constructed nature. It is the wild aurora of Tithonus with his synthetic and malign wiles, who fulfills what is inherent in Tintanabe in the reworking of the benign and moral nature of Tintanabe that's taking place in the later poem. If Tennyson reworks nature in Tithonus, then Tithonus as Wordsworth's speaker undergoes a similar reconfiguration. Tennyson's borrowed language works to question the process and value of the poem's abiding self, that sense of self, where the speaker discovers he's the same, but not the same person that he was 5 years before. Tithonus, too, cannot continue to transcend time in the way that is offered in the moment of Wordsworthian sublimity. Its sensations sweet do not pass into the purer mind with tranquil restoration as they do in Tintanabe. Tithonus becomes trapped within his own failing imagination and with his inconstant and discordant nature, Aurora. And there seems to be no hope of escape from this post-tinted world for Tithonus, no projections into or onto the future, but simply a perpetual present of loss and faded power as Tennyson continues to rework the mind's connection with nature. The sense of diminishing power of transcendence, a theme Wordsworth himself returns to in the ode, openly preoccupies the Victorians who begin to voice concerns that if Wordsworth's imaginative transcendence has lost its power. Matthew Arnold's fading gleam in Dover Beach, for instance, signals the extinction of Wordsworth's visionary project. Tithonus, I suggest, takes this preoccupation to extremes, as both the mind and nature lose their power in the post-Tinton world that's created in the poem. The mask of the dramatic monologue should allow Tennyson to shield himself from the implications of the poem's critique, but the nature of the inscription renders him unable to do so, as his re-rating of the earlier poem is laid bare. I end, like I say, we're almost at the end of the allotted time here. So I'm going to end with the analysis of Tennyson's late poem, Crossing the Bar. And in ending with Tennyson's valedictory lyric, the book substantiates the claim that Tennyson didn't move away from Wordsworth in his later years. The poem was written in October 89 when Tennyson was crossing the Solent, coming Tennyson to recall in a moment. In coming quickly to Tennyson, the poem reveals an automatic and instinctive recalling of Wordsworth. Tennyson's tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound of foam, resonates with the elegiac stanzas, for instance. Writing as if his had been the painter's hand to express what then I saw, Wordsworth's speaker says of Peel Castle, picture had it been of lasting ease. Elysian quiet without toil or strife, no motion but the moving tide, a breeze or merely silent nature's breathing life. Wordsworth's moving tide in Tennyson becomes a tide as moving as seems asleep, as the barely susceptible motion of the tide in elegiac stanzas reaches stasis. Tennyson's speaker hopes to be carried home for one last time on his sleeping tide, as the stanza itself in its wave-like rhythm mimics the action of the tide itself, simultaneously confirming yet undermining the speaker's wishes. That Tennyson should be carried on a moving yet recalcitrant tide of Wordsworth's language seems a fitting metaphor for the processes at work in his poetry. Tennyson's poetry has been fed, supported, clarified, complicated, and directed by the Wordsworthian echoes it contains, redirected by it in some instances. And I've attempted in this talk to move on from existing readings to offer a more complicated, nuanced view of Tennyson's relationship with Wordsworth poetry and some of its key themes, such as the re-encountering of the self in time, offering a more intricate view of Tennyson's dramatic experiments, the monologue and the monodrama, as well as more complex view of Tennyson's own relationship with the poetry of sensation. Tennyson not flooded by Wordsworth's presence in this period so much as borne by it. Yet at the same time, Tennyson redefines Wordsworth's status, reshaping the earlier poet for a new age and complicated standard Victorian models of the prophetic or nutritive Wordsworth of Matthew Arnold's Wordsworth's memorial verses. Wordsworth has a healing power of a new kind, helping Tennyson to heal the wound in his poetic art, to heal his crisis of faith, his crisis of composition, sometimes his crisis of form. It's through Wordsworth that Tennyson is able to anchor himself as poet, poet laureate, and Victorian cultural icon. If, as Arnold suggests, Tennyson overtakes Wordsworth in the public imagination from 1842, then this is a transition that's supported and facilitated by Wordsworth himself. Thank you.